So we wanted the students to have some practical knowledge of how food was actually grown. We do one session where the students come up to my house. We take about 45 minutes to go through the garden, and then I teach the session on organic. Who dares eat unwashed food? Good for you.
Really sweet.
You always want carrots usually after a first frost. What happens is that sends all its sugars down to preserve the root against the cold. Behind you is the tomato you've been eating from, that one over there, self-sown. You're free to pick any of those over there. This is basil. This is called Aussie Sweetie, and it does not flower, so you have to grow it from a shoot. I've been growing it now for 15 years. This is squash. Dan Barber, the chef at Blue Hill, started a seed company, and he made singleton-size butternut just for one person. That's the size they're meant to be, because I keep them for winter. These beds turn out to be just great. Obviously, they stop the deer. Do any of you know these peppers? They're hot, but not that hot. Anyone want to try? Tell the rest of us. Oh, you took a real courageous bite there. By the way, the ferny thing that's back there, it's asparagus.
Oh.
That's what asparagus does if you don't eat its shoot. You eat you're eating a shoot of asparagus. It's just coming up from the bottom. This was my attempt to plant a cover crop, sun hemp. And this here is something I tried. There's something called bugle culture. First you lay down newspaper, then you lay down logs, then you do swallow, and it's like a mound of wood that rots and then becomes a wonderful bed full of organic matter. This is called trifoliate orange or hardy orange. It is not usable. And if you take 4 or 5 of them and leave them in a bowl in your living room or someplace, they have a wonderful smell. I defy you to make anything from them. You know, I believe in trying to use everything. And what you end up with is pots coated with wax. That's invading milkweed, which I'm letting come in because I'm encouraging monarchs. Okay, we're going to see if I have any sweet potatoes. Okay, who wants to dig? That's it. Good for you. Okay, who wants sweet potatoes?
I'll take it. Where you can put it? Anyone wants to take them?
This is tomatillos. I make puree. This is my fire bowl where I roast peppers and eggplant and things like that. And that huge thing coming forward from the riverbank is asparagus. Here water comes in, washes across my property, I get flooded, which has destroyed me several times. And I keep coming back. And when we had Sandy, my shed was across the way against the maple tree. All the wooden structures in my yard were up against my back porch about 5-6 years ago. Every path, every plant thing was taken out. Garden was raised 2 feet. And I had a big storm, and all the raised beds were torn out and thrown upside down. The rising of the Hudson is causing the groundwater to rise. I had a wonderful crop of carrots, and they were all rotted, as were some of the potatoes. Any of the ground crops. I went through a period of extreme mourning, tried to decide what I was going to do this year. I have had raised beds before, so I decided I'd try. And I put in onions, I put in potatoes. I didn't really bury them, I just sort of put them on the surface and then put hay around them. And I got maybe a quarter of what I usually get. I got some potatoes. And then we had some very high tides, and we had 3 rains, and I'm back to where I was last year. Okay, so we've been out there. Everything's really quite wet. And if you stayed and stood on that roundel that you met on very long, your feet would begin to sink in. The unsaturated zone, where things would normally grow, is the portion of the subsurface above the groundwater table. The soil and rock in this zone contains air as well as water, which mine does not. Hydrologically, the unsaturated zone is often the main factor controlling water movement from the land surface to the aquifer. So the vadose zone extends from the top of the ground to the water table. So I'm suffering from a saturated vadose zone. But the real question is, can I go on gardening? There's a word that was invented about 9 years ago by an Australian to describe the sense of loss people feel when places that they love disappear around them. And it's called solastalgia, which is a wonderful word. It comes from solace and pain. And so it means the pain of the place that you took solace disappearing. So that's what I'm suffering from now. And since the bottom of my email says to have a garden is to have a future, and to have a future is to be alive, that's very threatening when you're 91 years old and you lose your garden. It's like, what do I do to keep going? But I've grown all my own vegetables for 20 years. So it affects more than my sense of myself. It affects what do I go to the market and buy it now? One of the reasons that I started growing all my own vegetables was because 25 years ago, I came to the conclusion that agriculture was in so much trouble. And the only way we could change it was to get the average person to know something about agriculture. People had to know farmers. They had to sort of be in touch with farmers so they understood what was going on. And I thought the only way they can be in touch with farmers if farmers are fairly close to where they are. And the only way farmers can be fairly close to where they are is if the people will buy what the farmer produces seasonally. So we have to promote seasonal diets. So that's how I became, as Brian Howell called it, the matriarch of the local food movement. It had nothing to do with the taste of it, like Alice Waters wanted tasty food. It had to do really with trying to say, because the first thing people would say to me when I talked about eating seasonally, which you have to eat if you're going to eat locally, is what would I eat in January? So I had to prove what you could eat in January. And so I did. It's really quite easy. It's not hard at all. You just have to eat different things. You'd have to be willing to not have tomatoes in January and have sweet potatoes. And although I found a way, I roast tomatoes on a flat pan for 4 hours at 225 with oil and salt and oregano. And then I put it on parchment paper on the sheet, and then I just roll it up and put it in the freezer in a plastic bag, and so I have them all winter. What don't I grow? I don't grow grain. I once grew wheat. I loved the way it looked. It's just beautiful. And I don't grow any animal products. Could I? Should I? You know how much vegetable product you have to produce to get a pound of meat? It's huge. I mean, if I had one cow out there, that would be the end of everything. And I could have chickens. Yeah. But bees are great, and I suspect that the bees here would be okay because we don't have pesticides around. And let me give you a few terms that may be useful to you. Does everybody know what a land-grant college is in this country? There was an act passed in 1862 that donated public lands to the states, quote, which may provide colleges for the benefit of agriculture and mechanical arts. But what land-grant colleges were supposed to do were to promote the agricultural and mechanical arts. It's usually in the land-grant schools which are doing the agricultural research. Accreditation, that you can advertise that your products are organic. You have to be certified, and you're certified by an agency accredited by the USDA. Agency accredits a few certifiers, and so the certifiers certify the farms. And there's a lot of concern that the whole system has slipped because some of the certifiers have certified CAFOs. It's those huge agglomerations of chickens under metal sheds and pigs under metal sheds, which are the opposite of what organic is. They have this thing about having outdoor access as one of the things, and so they have a little window that they can go out if they happen to want to take a vacation, but they never go out. The way the organic thing works, there was a law passed that told you how you had to farm and how you had to process if you were going to have your product called organic. Of course, once organic became popular and more people were eating it, the big guys wanted in. So they want to make the rules as lax as possible. And so that's what a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight. Productive, and what it's meant here is that you got the most product for the fewest humans involved. It could mean that you got the most product for the most land. It could mean that you got more calories, that were, more fuel calories from the calories that you put in to create the product, and which were, as you know, incredibly non-productive because the average American food product, the processed food product, is 10 calories in to 1 calorie out, even though they're very high calorie. but we've used so much energy to produce those foods. Okay, the theme of this session is Wendell Berry's comment, which is, an agriculture cannot survive long at the expense of the natural systems that support it and that provide it with models. And a farmer, Fred Kirschenman, who is the executive director of Stone Barns, if we try to impose uniform mediocrity upon this complex dynamic system, we invite collapse. And Pollen, he says, unsustainable has a meaning, he says, and it means sooner or later it must collapse. So that's what an unsustainable agriculture is. So, what is organic? Well, many critics over the years have implied that organic is based on an irrational fear of chemicals. You know, and nothing's pure. How can you want this irrationally pure food? And that organic agriculture is a method of growing food that doesn't make use of any synthetic chemicals in the growing, and that doesn't use any synthetic chemicals to control insects, diseases, and weeds. Are those the important characteristics? Is that the correct definition of organic? Organic is actually not negative. It's not about what you don't use, it's about what you do, which is a way of growing plants that starts with feeding the soil with cover crops and with compost, which is made of plant and animal wastes that are mixed and brought to a certain temperature by the activity within it and ends up in this wonderful, rich organic material. And then with rock powders and animal meals like limestone and green sand and rock phosphate and bone meal, unless you do vegan organic, in which case you're not. I realized that one day. I thought, my God, if you try to do vegan organic, you can't use blood meal or bone meal, which I use a lot of. Other than that, my garden could be suitable for veganism. You use these more complex materials and you don't go to the market and buy fertilizer. As several people say directly in the readings, is that the idea is to improve the soil, and if you, like Elliot Coleman says, you know, if you improve the soil, if you really feed the plant right, you don't need to worry about pesticides and herbicides because pesticides attack weak plants. I mean, pests attack weak plants. And so you make sure the plants are strong, and boy, you ought to see Elliot's plants. They are really strong. Organic agriculture is fundamentally about improving the soil, and that involves all these other things, what you put in, the cover crops, green manure crops. You can plant peas that just grow very low, and they're just adorable. They come up, they hold hands, and they sort of make this bed of peas, and then they just die in the fall, and the stuff goes into the soil. But you can actually eat the peas or the shoots or any. That's a great cover crop. I think very fundamental in organic, which is a notion of the pace of things. That is, if you throw a lot of nitrogen on the soil and plant a crop, you'll get the earliest crop. You'll get a really fast crop. And your neighbor farmers will all say, oh, look at Joe Blow, you know, he has this crop. If you plant organically, you do not throw that extra nitrogen on the soil. The crop comes up, it grows very slowly until things warm up and the soil begins to operate and the organisms in the soil begin to release nitrogen, and then the crop really grows. But farmers are very competitive, so this is one of the reasons it's so hard for farmers to go organic. It's because of the nature of the system. They're out there with farmers as friends. I mean, there aren't many people left out there, you know, so you want your neighbors to approve of what you're doing, and it's very hard to go organic. Fred Kirschman has a 2,000-acre farm, I guess, organic, out in North Dakota, South Dakota, I guess. And he once told me that he had not used an herbicide, and when he didn't use an herbicide, this yellow mustard came up in the field, and it broadcast to everyone that this man was a sloppy farmer. You know, that he didn't keep the weeds out of his farm. And you had to just tolerate that and wait and know that in the end your crop was going to benefit from it. When organic began, it began with a series of observations in India, and Bob Rodale brought it to this country. It began as just recognizing that you could use composted materials and other materials that could be added to the soil and you could grow terrific crops. It began with the idea that you could not have to use all those purchased inputs. But nobody really understood, which as we now realize in our own profession, that we now recognize there's something called a microbiome in our bodies that makes a huge difference in everything, in how we metabolize things, whether we recover from things, whether we have indigestion, all kinds of things, whether you can even get pregnant. There's the same sort of thing in the soil. It's probably a continuous microbiome. There's this vast collection of materials in the soil enabling certain things to take place. I used to think that you put organic materials in the soil to change the texture and to feed the plants directly, like you put nitrogen materials in and they decay and you'd get the nitrogen for the plants. And then I began to learn about the microbiome, and when I grew sweet potatoes, I had the experience one year when I had just redone the whole garden, as I told you all that I did, raised it by 2 feet, and the soil brought in was just terrible. And there was good stuff added to part of the soil, but there were 2 extra beds out there that were like rock. I had a friend come over with a pickaxe to break one up. I mean, it was just like rock. And I thought, what can I plant here? You know, I'm a gardener. I can't just let this bed sit here with nothing. And so I thought, well, I'll plant sweet potatoes, because I planted sweet potatoes before in odd places and they seem to do well. So I'll just plant sweet potatoes. And maybe I'll only just get that lovely foliage, but you know, whatever. So I planted sweet potatoes and the vines grew fine. I didn't know what was going on underneath. And at the end of the season, I finally went out and said, well, I should see whether I have anything. And so I went in, and the soil was totally transformed. You could put your hand in it. It was like soil. It was crumbly, and I got a decent quantity of sweet potatoes, but mostly I went out the next morning just to look at the soil again and say, what on earth is this? So I asked around if anybody knew. We had a farmer from Germany working on a farm in the county, and he said to me, oh, that's Glomalin. I said, what's that? And he said, well, it's something that makes the soil particles cling together. This class of organisms takes sugar from those big roots of the sweet potatoes, and in exchange for that, it produces this sort of glutinous material that glues the particles of soil together. It helps all the mineral. It recruits minerals basically to the plant, you know, transfers them, and does all this other stuff. And basically, they said we would not be able to farm without it. And it said the USDA had discovered Glomalin. It was thought of as a contaminant of soil until about 10 years ago. And I said to myself, Jesus, we could have killed it with something. You know, we could have thrown something in the ground, a DDT, and it could have killed, you know, and we would not even have known this had happened. And I realized, I then began to do a lot of reading. There's a wonderful book, I think it's called Notes from the Underground, by a soil scientist from Cornell, that's all about the underground life. So what you're adding organic matter to the soil for is to feed the soil organisms, all those organisms that are doing all this work that we never even knew about. And we still don't know about them because there are so many, and they are totally dependent on each other, as we are, but they know it. And so they will not grow isolated in a laboratory. You can't sort one out and do a scientific experiment on it the way we'd normally do. It's very hard to try to study them. So that's what organic is really about. It's really about the way the natural world works and trying to keep that intact. And the reason you don't put on strong fertilizers, concentrated fertilizers, is they often kill those organisms. When you're trying to study organic food and its healthfulness, that you're dealing, as you always are with all foods, but you're dealing with a food product containing thousands, if not millions, of organic compounds, since they're all organic because they're all in the food. And you're with a human body, which has the same number, and how those interact with each other is, for the most part, deeply mysterious. And we know tiny fragments of it, and we operate on that as if it was the whole truth. And as we all well know from our own health histories and our own life histories, it isn't that simple at all, and it isn't always there's a lot we don't know and a lot we can't do anything much about. And if the body, one time, I remember, had to talk to a bunch of doctors up at Cornell, and they invited me to talk because I had helped write a book about infant nutrition, prenatal and infant nutrition, and I was at the moment thought I was an expert, which I wasn't. And so they invited me up to talk, and then they had me to lunch. And I remember saying, I just had an insight the other day. I thought, all you could really do as a doctor is you could give me some kind of poison that will either cure me or won't. And you can cut me up and take something out. You can't make me well. If I'm going to get well, it's me that's going to get me well. It's my body that will accept or not accept. And that's all about being well nourished. So I was once asked to give a talk at the Eco Farm Conference in California, which is decidedly pro-organic. It's the kind of conference I love to talk to because it's full of farmers, and if they like what you say, they pound their feet on the floor. I was asked to talk to them about whether organic was more nutritious, and I knew that was such a charged topic in that setting. And so I did a hell of a lot of research and to see whether there was any evidence. And the truth is there wasn't. In other words, there was a real problem in studying it because often non-organic was simply a conventional field, and organic was a conventional field from which that year they hadn't put on any chemicals. And since we know that the organic standards requires 3 years for your soil to adjust, and so there were no really decent studies where you compared a certified organic farm with them. So I had to say that, but I said I thought that they were looking in the wrong place. I said, I think that for you to depend on the value of organic on just whether it's more nutritious is stupid because it's got all these other environmental values. And it's the sustainable way to grow food, and that you should not emphasize just this limited thing about nutrients. And afterwards, someone came up to me and he said, I think it's going to turn out to be the intermediary metabolites, the phytochemicals, and all the things we now know make a difference, like vitamin C, for instance. If you eat a whole orange, the matrix in which that vitamin C is embedded is very different than if you're drinking orange juice. You're going to get it at a different speed, you're going to digest it in a different way. So many processed foods are made of substances that have been exposed to very high heat processing or high pressure processing, like puffed wheat. Years ago, when I did some testimony and I was involved in children's television advertising, I wanted to find out something about cereal. I found some articles, and one article by a chemist who worked for a cereal maker, somebody said, yes, I know you add so much of different vitamins, but what's the baseline? In other words, which of that you're putting on the label is indigenous? Oh, he said, when we finish processing, there's nothing left. There's no nutrients left. It's all added nutrients.
Yeah. I happen to have that article, the Matrix article.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it just happened to be in my binder. So their 3 rules are, from all of the research that they did, is 1, eat a minimum of 83% of your calories from plant origin. Very specific. A maximum of 15% calories from ultra-processed foods.
Are you all familiar with this classification, Monteiro, of foods, processed foods and ultra-processed foods? There's foods, which are just foods, which we have to remember is like a tiny percentage of the grocery store, but it's just foods. And then there's processed foods, which would be things like canned tomatoes, bread, things that are made from foods, but are minimally processed. And then there's ultra-processed foods, which have almost no foods in them. They have only these substances that are separated out from the fat and protein. They now make up, 50%?
60% of the U.S. food supply is ultra-processed.
Ultra-processed foods, which have no raw food material in them. They have only ingredient. They're made from processed foods, basically. There's a profound problem with all our dietary intake kinds of messaging because people don't know what they're eating. I was struck by the fact the articles in the readings this time sort of were on 2 things. One was the series of articles about the studies that had been done of organic, and they went out and they interviewed people, and they came back and they said, look, there's something here. There are people growing large areas of crop organically, and they're not having insect problems any more than ordinary farmers are, and we should look into this. And of course, it caused such a stink. So then another study comes along, that alternative agriculture study that Chuck Benbrook did for the American Academy of Sciences. And again, there's this huge, huge feedback reaction to it. So they say 10 years later they're going to do another study, and that's the one that Chuck Benbrook then discusses the relationship between the two studies and shows that the latest study, of course, which was a year late coming out because it was so difficult, right? Was just said, look, we should have different policies and we should do more research. But he never taught, I mean, they'd actually shown in the other studies that it was going on and lots of people were doing it. You didn't really need more research. What you needed was more research into how to help them do it. You have to understand that when I came into this field in the 70s, to talk about organic in any kind of favorable way was to band yourself a fattest. Organic was nonsense, and anyone who stood up for it was crazy. And I had the experience of being asked to come and testify before the Attorney General of the state of New York about the fraud that was going on in health food stores and so forth. And so I decided, I can't remember whether Rodale Press asked me to come, somebody asked me to come, and anyway, so I spent an enormous amount of time trying to say what I wanted to really say, which was that they were tarring, because there were bad actors in the field and there were some people exploiting it, you didn't tar the whole thing with that, and that these people often sold into the standard food supply. They were doing it for other reasons, and I ended up saying that did I respect somebody who bought carrots because they were grown organically more than someone who went and paid a premium to get pre-buttered, frozen, sliced carrots for more money? I said, no, I respected the person who bought the organic food first. Anyway, to leave it, I carefully made clear that I was not a nut and that I just thought that people should be a little less judgmental. And the next day, my picture was on the front page, or not the front page, probably inner page of the New York Times. It said, "Nutritionist defends food fattists." You just didn't do that, you know? And I wasn't even, I don't think I'd graduated yet. So there was just tremendous hostility. So I wanted to go back, since you can see from those earlier things, why do you think that was? What was pushing that? Why was it so impossible to consider a different way?
Money? I feel like it has to be so much money, it has to be involved.
Yeah, from whose money?
Like these food companies that are producing these products.
Right, the inputs, the people who are doing, I mean, there was a time, and I can't remember 1985, they had a program called Low Input Sustainable Agriculture, authorized by Congress for the Food Security Act of 1985, in response to widespread acknowledgement that science-based information was lacking for farmers seeking to reduce chemical use in crop production. It was called LISA, Low Input Sustainable Agriculture. And I went to a meeting not long after that where they were talking about the fact that they were going to call it the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, because LISA was really bad news. Nobody wanted low inputs. The input makers did not want a low input agriculture. It was like, and it had a female acronym. And that was not good for the standpoint of farming. In 1990, we passed the Organic Food Production Act, which regulated the labeling and processing standards, really is what it labeled, what you had to do in order to be able to label your food organic. And so that's when the second report, the Sustainable Agriculture Report, came out. At that time, they didn't call it organic, like they did that first report. They called it sustainable, which was less threatening, and then recommends research, even though they haven't acted on the past research. But meanwhile, a market for organics is developing. The money begins to come into the field. It's not that they're promoting the farmers, they're not recommending more research to help the farmers. They're just eating up other companies. And you saw that graph, that all these little companies that were producing organic foods and selling them in the marketplace have now been absorbed into these large companies. And I learned just recently that, the people who actually supply the stores, that sector is now down to 2 major companies. And I heard it from somebody who runs a store. He says, if you have a neighbor down the block who is growing beautiful organic tomatoes and you want to sell them, you can't. There's no way to get it into your store because everything comes in through these 2 companies that control it all. Many of the readings have to do with the big guys making it easier to be organic. I was on the National Organic Standards Board for 5 years. The National Organic Standards Board is a board made up of people from different professions. There's consumer representatives, marketing representatives, food company representatives, farmer representatives, certifier representatives, environmental representatives. There's all the people, so it's really meant to be balanced. And I know the kinds of pressures that came onto us. I mean, people would come and testify in front of us. People who made tanned leather wanted their leather scraps to be considered organic feed for animal. I mean, you have no idea the request that got made. But anyway, so the National Organic Standards Board has always been this sort of bulwark of people really committed to organic. Well, that's changed. I mean, they have giant marketers on the board. They have farmers who are only partly organic on the board. They have put people on the board, and they're certifying CAFOs. And probably the worst, as you gather, or at least I think it's the worst from the readings, is the fact that they've agreed to say hydroponics is organic. And what we said at the beginning about what organic is about is what? The soil. The what? The soil. The soil, right. So how can you have organic without the soil? And I hope, I'd like to try to make a picture for you of a hydroponic berry growing operation, which may be several acres of things that are covered with these pots inside with the berries growing in them, and ask you in what way that helps the environment. That's the real issue. I mean, you're taking the very heart out of what organic was about growing in concert with the environment around it. It's just separating it from the environment around it. It's totally artificial. I'm on the advisory board of the Real Organic Project, which are the people that are setting up regulations to produce and have produced a supplementary label that can be put on. Certain farms could say that they're following, and part of it is this thing of not allowing CAFO food and not allowing food that's grown hydroponically and so forth and so on. The problem with big organic is the problem with the food system generally, and Michael Pollan, if any of you went back and read that chapter about big organic, is the whole system is still floating on a sea of petroleum. I mean, that's the problem. And there was a time, 4 or 5 years ago, when we used to talk about that we're running out. We're not running out, unfortunately, we're just running out of earth because we're fracking everything. And so we're creating further damage to the planet. We need to be aware of our own ignorance and the extent of our own ignorance in order, in the face of a mystery like soil fertility, like the productivity of the earth before we ever touched it, before humans came along to change it. The earth was producing, the prairies were incredibly lavishly rich with green material. I mean, the earth was producing long before we ever came along. And we don't know why, and we don't know how to make it happen, except organic farmers are closer than other people are. We can't treat nature like a machine. This was published in October 2019, and it's titled "The Key to Saving Family Farms is in the Soil" by David Montgomery. And he's talking about the fact that he was going across the country, and he noticed that wherever people were using cover crops, there was new machinery in the barns, there were new cars on the road, everything looked shiny and flourishing, and wherever people weren't using cover crops, it looked like things were in decay. And that it was really a change, that just that one step of beginning to use cover crops as a source of fertility and to keep the soil covered in the winter so it doesn't just erode away, had made that kind of difference. Anybody have any questions, any answers?
So the thing is, I feel like no one even really knows what hydroponic is.
I know.
So how is, and like without like large government funding, which is never going to happen, how do you get the word out there? How do you educate people so that when they see this label, they know what it means?
Yeah, well, you should really go on the web and look up Real Organic, and they posted a series of, they've been sending me out a series of films with farmers, and one of the ones that I have is a film of this man who is the one who's explaining what's happened to the middle section, how it's all collapsed into just 2 people, and talking about how difficult it is, and that even if they put this label on food, this Real Organic, that will the people running the stores even allow them in, you know, and then will it make any difference? Right. I think until much too long, I would come into this class with a sort of headset that said, people think organic is a fad. And then I realized that everything had shifted. I mean, organic was a different kind of fad. You know, organic was like popular. You didn't even get in trouble for mentioning it, you know, which happened really fast. But it's like when money gets hold of it, when the powers that be decide that they want to have a piece of this pie, all bets are off. I mean, that chart, organic industry structure, January 2016, showing the collapse of the system. Then you can see Cargill had started at that point in a joint marketing agreement with some people. You can be sure that a lot more people have ended up under Cargill. So you're not buying it from Annie anymore.
So, and probably the one thing, you know, which we said earlier, but I think is really worth saying again, is if you're talking to people and they're mentioning organic, or somebody asks you, really just making it clear that the convention, what people think of is what it doesn't have. Oh, it's pesticide free, it's fertilizer free. And just changing that around and saying it's about the ecosystem, it's about the soil, it's about the process. I think if people could start to understand that, I think that that's a really
yes, and that it's not just about no pesticides.
Yeah,
it's well beyond that.
And I think people, with a little explanation, people can get that, because organic does have it's a good thing, but we're so taught it's a good thing because of not being pesticides, which is why they got the hydroponics through. We're growing it without pesticides, it's got to be organic. You know, and why the public is going to have a hard time with it, because the public has such that perception.
Yeah, I also think our culture has a lot to do with it, because if you look at like Europe, for instance, so they have like the concept of terroir, and I think it just makes like the ties to like what you're eating so much more powerful. But I just think it's interesting they have a whole word, and they use it in the wine industry a lot, like, oh, the terroir, it's all about the soil and it's healthy. And
Yeah, you can't imagine what would the terroir be of tanks.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the Organic Production Act, it's all about soil and improving the soil, and you have until such and such a time to get it to such and such a state, and you have to go 3 years before you can call yourself organic. I mean, it's all about soil. It's very hard to be on the front lines and try to keep organic pure. I know that, I mean, because I was there, and it's like the pressures are just fierce, and the more the board moves away from the people that are really supposed to be on the board to sort of faux environmentalists or faux small farmers, you know, the harder it gets, because you get outvoted. Fred and I got outvoted by 1 vote. We lost by 1 vote, saying that you couldn't have synthetics in organic.